You have to sit here. Wait. Wait. Okay.
Let's mute everyone now. You're mute all.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Nice to see you all tonight. We want to welcome you on another one of our Zoom events. Always educating ourselves more about different facets of Jewish life. Today, we are Rosh Chodesh Av. Today we are in the first day of the month of Av. We're right in the middle of the 3-week period, mourning for the destruction of both of our temples. When the month of Av enters, there's a much stronger focus on the destruction that we experienced, a lot of mourning, customs that we have and laws during this time. But the main part of this period is not so much to focus on the sadness of what we lost, but to recognize the treasure that we had and how to regain it again. And, this is a time when Jewish identity comes into play. The Jewish people can imagine we had a temple, constant miracles going on. The presence of God was felt in a very strong way, especially during the time of the first temple period when we had prophecy and many other forms of God's communication to the Jewish people. And yet we lost our sense of identity and we drifted away towards idol worship and other sins, moving ourselves away from God. In the second temple, also a very holy period, but yet we didn't know how to live with each other. We had baseless hatred going on between Jews. Everyone was at each other's necks. It was a very difficult time, and when there's no unity amongst the Jews, everything else falls apart, and we lost the second temple. So the clear identity of who we are as an individual and as a people is very closely tied to the temple. And this is a time when other forces, the Babylonians in the first, the Romans in the second, tried to supersede the Jewish identity with their identity. But at the end of the day, we are told, and we know this through history, that the Jewish identity will never really be lost. And somehow we always find our way back to God. Unfortunately, we may lose some along the way, but you never know. Sometimes their children or their offspring find their way back to God. So at a time like this, in a period like this, when we have to be focusing on our identity and how tied in it is to the temple and to God, I thought that for tonight's Zoom event, I invited our speaker who's on with us now, Robert Samuel Walker, who grew up, like many, as an unaffiliated Jew from a mixed marriage in a big Jewish city, Toronto, but only through a chance encounter with a Christian missionary did his life change forever and bring him on the trajectory, the road to what today is his life of observant Judaism. He lives now in Toronto with his wife and 3 children, 3 daughters. He actually has been involved in the Jewish world. He's a consultant for nonprofit organizations, for fundraising, management, and education. He's a lecturer and educator. And there's no better time than at this point, when we're getting so close to Tisha B'Av, to remember that you never know what the catalyst will be. Will it be a Christian missionary? Will it be some other force or a Jewish force that will bring you back to God? But ultimately, every Jew, deep inside, our true identity never gets lost. And just before I bring on our speaker, the Torah tells us, the Talmud tells us of a story that's very shocking, but the story that the Lubavitcher Rebbe once shared during a Farbrengen, one of his talks early on in his leadership. And it was a very emotional talk. And the story is about a Jewish woman in the times of the Second Temple. And this woman left her Jewish roots and embraced the Roman culture to the point that she married a Roman officer. She totally abandoned her Jewish life. And when the Romans were setting about to capture the temple, she was brought along with her husband. He brought her along in the battle. I guess maybe she had a position there, even in the army. A woman who turned her back on God and Judaism. They came to the temple and they started to destroy the temple piece by piece. And she saw how they were destroying the temple, torturing and mercilessly killing the Kohanim, the priests who were trying to protect it. The Torah tells us that this woman, Miriam Bas Bilga, Miriam, the daughter of Bilga, ran to the altar and she grabbed with both her hands onto the altar and she sort of screamed out to God, 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 how long will you let the enemy suck out the blood of our people? And this is at a moment of triumph for the Romans of a life she chose, but when she was faced with the truth, she realized her true identity is a Jew. But this is a very special time for us to really identify with who we are. And that's why I'm looking forward, I'm sure as you are, to hear from Robert Samuel to tell us his story, his journey. After he talks, we will take questions. You can put them in the chat or you raise your hand, then we'll have a chance for questions to be asked and he will answer all the questions. So without any further ado, I introduce Robert and everyone can see him here. Robert, please take the floor. One second, Robert, 1 second. Robert, 1 second. We have to unmute you.
Can you unmute yourself? Right, I muted him, but
Okay, you're
There we
good.
go. Okay, you can hear me?
We hear you well.
Hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Everyone else, give a thumbs up if you can hear me. Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the Krasnanskis for hosting me. It's a pleasure to visit virtually Chabad in the town. You know, I have to tell you that you are close to possibly one of my favorite spots in the universe. That is District Bagel. You know, when I take my kids to Montreal, you know, District Bagel is always it. If I have a friend or a colleague or anything going to Montreal, I send them a text and I say, hey, you're in Montreal. And they say, yes, I'm going to District Bagel. I'll get you something there. So, you know, anyway, so enough about bagels, but you live in obviously a wonderful Jewish community in Montreal. You know, I visit whenever I can. Obviously, current circumstances are hard for everyone, but I hope that
Robert, District Bagel is in our neighborhood, actually.
I know, that's why I'm saying.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I'm saying it's I know it's on Lucerne. That's what I'm saying. It's right around the corner. When I know you're right there, so I said you're in the presence of your greatness, and you're also in the presence of greatness. So
now
that's
we
why
know
I
what to
mentioned
send you when we go when we know people going to Toronto.
Well, thank you. You know, I once tried to import District Bagel Montreal bagels to Toronto. It didn't work out. But anyway, like I said, I should stop speaking about District Bagel now. You know, they'll have to be a co-sponsor of this. But anyway, like I said, I love visiting Montreal, and obviously you have a fine the Chabad on the town. I've done some, visit your website, your Facebook page, and it looks like you have a pretty, tremendous community. So yesha kol to the
Robert, maybe talk closer to your microphone because you're fading out a little.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I had headphones here, but the battery wasn't working, so I had to move over. And if I speak too quickly, please let me know. So first of all, again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Although virtually, but it's a great privilege and an opportunity to share my story, and I hope bring some chizuk, bring some strength, and some inspiration to everyone watching, both on Zoom and Facebook. I should tell you, by the way, although this story really begins probably when I was a child, the first time I ever told this story was 2 years ago. Was hosted by an organization, a wonderful organization called Jews for Judaism, to help engage Jews like myself and like others who have been engaged in Christianity or Buddhism or New Age or cults and so on. And so that was really the first time 2 years ago. And I've only spoken maybe half a dozen times on this before. So, I'm not, this isn't something that I've done 100 times. It's still very raw and still very weird for me to think about speaking and about this topic, so inherently personal to a group of people. But again, I thank you for hearing me. So a little bit about me to grow up. As the rabbi mentioned, my name is Robert Walker, and I grew up in Toronto. I was born in Toronto, raised in Richmond Hill. My mother is Jewish, but my father is not. Sort of a family joke, because the last name is Walker. My parents joked that when I was born, my father's name in the old country is Walkerwitz from Poland, but that's not the case. It's Walker. It's as English as non-Jewish as you can get, but it's sort of a funny joke. But when I was born, although my father's not Jewish, my mother is, I grew up with a lot of high expectations. When I was born, my parents put in the newspaper an ad. They said, we announced the birth of Dr. Robert Walker. So, they already had high pressure, for me right from the get-go. That was a joke, by the way. So it gets better, don't worry. So a little bit about me. Like I said, I grew up in an intermarried home. My father is not Jewish. My mother is non-observant, of course. I grew up with a sister. I was born at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto, Har Sinai, of course, and I was raised in the suburbs. I have a younger sister, 3 years my junior, and I grew up in a home that was loving, in a home that was caring, that was definitely, I think, supportive of me. It was a Jewish home, but it was not an observant home. I grew up as what I like to call a Jew in my heart. I was a coronary Jew. I was a Jew in my heart, right? I didn't necessarily know what that meant. I didn't necessarily know certainly the mitzvahs or even really the sort of the bigger philosophy of what it meant to be a Jew. But certainly, although some people, and my sister would always describe herself as half Jewish, I always identified myself as fully Jewish. There was never a question. My father was not Jewish, but of course I was Jewish. And it wasn't just because, Judaism passes through matrilineally through my mother. It was never a question for me. My parents got divorced when I was probably 7 years old. And I remember I would go to my father's house for Xmas, and you have the tree, and I would go to my mother's house for the, and I just remember thinking now, in my mid-30s now, how strange it was, that experience. But that's really the experience that I grew up in the milieu in which I grew up. But like I said, despite all of that, there was never a question that I was 100% Jewish. It wasn't half Jewish, half not. I was Jewish, but I had a non-Jewish father, and hence the last name. And so I grew up in a public school. I grew up I went to Pleasantville Public School, and it was at the corner of Easy Street and Neighborly Lane, sort of very kitschy, in a town called Richmond Hill, which many of you are probably familiar with. And this was really sort of your typical suburban, about probably 30% of the kids in the school were Jewish. It was very Jewish, but very culturally Jewish, very secular Jewish, right? I didn't know anybody who was observant, or I didn't, the thought of, Torah education or Torah was very foreign, but Judaism and Jewish life was everywhere and all around me. Like I said, all my friends were Jewish. I remember half the houses in the street, had mezuzahs. It was and probably even more Jewish now than it was then. And that's sort of where I grew up until really my mother divorced, but I continued to live with my mother, as did my sister. But like I said, I would go and spend the weekends and so on with my father. And this was really up until I was 17 years old, and I went to the University of Ottawa. And that was during that time, the first time I visited Montreal, and fell in love with your wonderful city, of course. And so I went to the University of Ottawa, and every Jewish mother, I was told, every Jewish mother was supposed to say, no, I don't want you to go away to school. I want you to stay. I want you to stay home. My mother was the only Jewish mother who said, I want you to go away for school. I want you to, learn and spread your wings and get new experiences. And I was the only, teenager who said, I don't want to go anywhere. I want to stay home. But nonetheless, I lost that argument, and I went to the University of Ottawa, which is a wonderful school. But I was really very much a homebody. I was really the person who, I know if I had gone to school at Ryerson or the University of Toronto or York, I would have gone to school and come home and gone to school and come home. But because I was forced to go to the University of Ottawa, far enough that I couldn't come home all the time, I didn't have a car, it really meant that I really had to immerse myself if I was not going to have a miserable 4 years in school. And I remember one of the first things that struck me when I was on campus during Frosh Week, which is, of course, the first introductory week of the campus, was just being overwhelmed with the amount of people who were completely unlike me. Now, this was strange because although I grew up in a suburb, it was very Jewish, but I didn't grow up under a rock. I knew that there were many different people all around me. Still, by the time I had come to university, I had never really engaged or seen, let alone engaged, just at least seen people who were so diverse in their opinions, who took opinions seriously. Because the way I grew up, Judaism and Jewish life was a lifestyle. Everything was a lifestyle. Right? I'm not even making a value judgment. It was a lifestyle. There wasn't necessarily a religious component to it. It wasn't ethical monotheism. It wasn't God told you to do this. It wasn't we're connecting to an ancient history or the infinite. It was Judaism as a culture, right? And so when I get to university and I met Jews who took Judaism seriously. I met Christians who took Christianity. I met Muslims. And forget even just religiously. I met people who were, communists and socialists and capitalists and anarchists and save the whales and environmentalists and everything you could possibly imagine. And these are people who took everything that they were fighting for intensely seriously. And it was something completely different because I grew up in a very parv environment. Wasn't too hot, wasn't too cold, right? It was very comfortable. It was very neutral. It was very vanilla, very beige. And I get to a place and these are 18, 19-year-old university students and they're fighting for what they believe in. And this was completely shocking to me because, again, this was completely foreign. It wasn't even what they were fighting for. It was just the chiddush, the novelty that there are people who are fighting for incredible things. I may agree or disagree, but it was like, where am I? So this was really the environment in which I found myself. And I think one of the other elements as well was that although I was completely non-observant in Toronto, Richmond Hill, very unengaged, disengaged from religious Jewish life or any Jewish life for that matter at all, the old adage, absence makes the heart grow fonder. And so I actively sought out Jewish life. I didn't think I was, but I was seeking out because I was in a place where it's a much smaller Jewish community, even in Ottawa, which has a smaller community than Toronto or Montreal, certainly. Carleton is where most of the Jews were, not University of Ottawa. And so it was really at a small campus of maybe a few hundred Jews. So I had to actively seek out Jewish life. And I did. And I went to, Shabbat dinners from the Jewish Student Association. And I went to sort of when they had a speaker, I went to a speaker, but there was nothing actively Jewish. And so I remember thinking one day, everybody's taking this so seriously. And this was in 2007, really when, if you recall, 2003, my apologies, 2003, when I started university. This is when the Intifada, right, the terrorist war against the suicide bombings against Israel were really very bad. And I remember watching the news and reading the news and thinking, this is horrible, unbelievable, Israel's under attack. And then one day I stopped and I thought, well, why do I care? Because at that point, I had never been to Israel before. Israel was a foreign concept to me. I didn't speak Hebrew. I had never been to Israel before. I believed in Israel, but Israel was no more part of my identity than being a male or being Canadian or why was Israel so important to me? And so I said, if Israel's important to me because I'm Jewish. And then I remember thinking, well, who cares if you're Jewish? You could easily not be Jewish. Why do you care if you're Jewish, and what does Jewish mean? So I said, maybe I should see what that means. So this was at a time there was no Chabad on campus. There is a Chabad now, but there wasn't then. But there was a professor on campus, an Orthodox professor who ran out of the goodness of his heart, a chemistry professor, davening prayers all the time in classes. And I went, and it started in his living room and went to a basement of an apartment. And that's where I first started to get engaged, and first started to, just become connected and at least familiar with going to synagogue. And this was really going on first year and second year. By the time third year came, I found the local Chabad. I had moved off campus, and I found the Ottawa Torah Center with Rabbi Bloom, who had given me my first pair of tefillin after I graduated. So definitely very near and dear to my heart. And I was continuing to grow and continuing to learn and go to Torah classes. And I remember, once it was actually Rabbi Bloom's father. I was sitting there, and there was a Shabbaton, and the rabbi puts his arm around me, and he says, do you learn any Torah? Do you go to any Torah classes? And I was a 19-year-old kid in university. I said, I'm very busy. And he looked at me and says, everybody's busy. You make the time. And I just it was like this light bulb that went off, and I said, I have to start to get more involved. And I started to learn more. And that was really my entire experience in university. And I finished university, and I was more engaged and more affiliated, and it was great and wonderful and amazing. And I got this pair of tefillin, which I started to put on every day. I moved back to Toronto, and I moved in, as I mentioned, my parents are not together. So I moved in with my father, and I started to try to keep Shabbat as best I could. Now, the problem with keeping Shabbat when you are living in someone else's home who is neither Jewish nor observant is some of the halachas, the malachas of Shabbos can look a little bit interesting. So there was a light bulb that you're not supposed to flip light switches on. And so every Erev Shabbos on Friday, I would unscrew the light bulb and I would put it away. And every Friday afternoon after, my father would come home and say, what is this guy doing? So he would plug it right back in again. And so every Shabbos, I probably lost about 30 pounds. The lights were all off because I didn't want to be a big freak and leave all the lights on. My father would turn them off, and I didn't want to explain. It was very weird. And so this was really at a very unpleasant time, where in the wintertime, when Shabbat started at 5 o'clock, that was it. I'm living in pitch darkness. And so that was really how it began. But nonetheless, I pulled through. And I was working at the time, and I was working consulting downtown. And every single day I would put on tefillin. Every single day I would daven. Every single day I would say my prayers. I didn't know the blessings over food, but I was learning and learning. And this was around when YouTube was really starting up. And I remember watching a lot of stuff, Jewish music and Jewish lectures. And it was amazing and incredible. And the way YouTube, as all social media works, is that when you're clicking one thing, it wants to show you what you're watching, and it wants to show you something similar because it wants you to keep watching YouTube. And so I was watching these classes and rabbis and shiurim, and one day I came across a video, and the title was something like, Rabbi debates a Christian missionary. Excuse me. And I remember thinking, what do you mean? What is there to talk about here? This is like a member of the Flat Earth Society debating, which apparently is a real thing, debating a Rhodes Scholar. I remember thinking, like, what is this going to be 30 seconds long? What are we even talking about? So I said, you know what? Like, this was back in the day when I didn't have 3 kids and I had all the time in the world to just watch an hour-long YouTube video, which I can't imagine that time again. But I remember I said, oh, I'll watch it. It should be entertaining. And, I'd be interested to see what this missionary could possibly say. And I remember it so vividly. I watched this video. It was probably 50 minutes long. And I watched the entire thing. And this is with an Orthodox rabbi. I wouldn't necessarily call it the most scholarly Orthodox rabbi in the world, but definitely an Orthodox rabbi and a Christian missionary who never was born a Jew. And I watched this thinking it would be entertaining. And I remember my feeling at the end of this video that you probably had to pick my jaw off the floor, because I remember thinking there's nothing to talk about. And by the end of the video, I didn't know what to think. It's not that I thought the rabbi didn't make good opinions or good arguments or good points. I thought that he made a number of good points. But I thought that the other guy also made points that he was constantly pointing to the Torah and pointing to the Talmud, the Gemara, and saying, this refers to, Yashka, this refers to the Christian Messiah, didn't you know? It's not just that he's this Messiah out there, he's yours. And I remember thinking, like, this is very strange to me. This guy who was born a Jew, but who nonetheless definitely actively identifies with another religion, knows more about the Torah than I do, knows more about the oral law, the Talmud, the Gemara, the Mishnah than I do, right? And here he is quoting this here and there, saying basically this refers to not just that this refers to their Messiah, but this also, proves their theologies and their points and so on. I remember just being completely shocked by this. And I would say without getting too much into details, because I could go for weeks and weeks on the details, this led to an indescribably dark and obsessive phase in my life, where I remember finishing that video, and it wasn't just, boy, that was interesting, onto, I have to get up and go to work. It wasn't that. It was, oh my gosh, what is reality? Where am I spending my eternity? Who is the creator of the universe? Do the Jews have it wrong? I don't think you can come up with bigger questions than these. And these are the questions which were asked. It wasn't just, which political system is best, or which, this was the biggest question that a human being could possibly ask, and which we have been asking since the beginning of time. Who created us and where are we going? And again, because this wasn't just a Christian missionary opening of a book and saying, here, this is holy. He's saying, this is your book and you are obligated to follow this, was completely shocking. And this began a process lasting about 2 years, where every single day I would be going on to, Christian messianic, chat forums and reading everything there, and going on to Jewish chat forums and reading everything there, and watching Jewish, educational videos, and watching Christian, apologetic, videos, and debating online, and to the point where, and it wasn't clear to me, because every time something was shown to me, some argument or some proof text, I'll get into proof text in a bit, of course, there was a Jewish response to it, right? As I said, Jews for Judaism is really the only organization which was actively, giving resources to the other side. But really, I think there's something like 300 organizations out there devoted to converting Jews to Christianity. 300 organizations. Jews for Jesus is the most common. There's Chosen People Ministry. There's many organizations devoted exclusively to converting Jews, just Jews, to Christianity. So this is pretty overwhelming. And as you can imagine, there's pretty, the fancy videos and so on and so forth. But I remember I didn't know what to do, because I'm reading one thing and then I read something else, and I read one thing and I read something else, and I read one thing and I read something else, and I didn't know where to go, where to turn. I got to the point where I was looking for signs in every little thing. I remember thinking, God, if you send me a message in the next 30 seconds, then I'll know. And maybe I heard something, maybe I didn't. Oh, I thought I heard something there. I turned on the radio. It was to the point. I would imagine that any healthcare professional, I haven't asked one, but I would suspect that any healthcare professional, there's one watching, mental health professional, would identify this as obsessive compulsive behavior. Obviously unhealthy, obviously ludicrous, right? I didn't know where to turn. I remember saying, if I can't get clarity based on reading the Torah or reading arguments, then maybe God's just going to come down to me, or God's going to give me, what do I do? You can hear I'm already sort of babbling. I'm losing my articulateness, because this was an incredible time where there was probably not 5 minutes, and I don't exaggerate, there was probably not a period of 5 minutes every single day of my waking day when I was not wondering if I was going to hell or heaven when I died. 5 minutes. Now you can imagine what that would do to a human being, and what that was doing to a human being. I wasn't eating, I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't focusing on work, right? My work was, literally there was I was completely obsessed, and not that I wanted to be. I was losing my mind in this, and I didn't know what to do. Really, up until the point where there was, I think one night, I was in bed, and lying in bed, about to go to sleep, and I remember thinking of Pascal's wager, Blaise Pascal, the 16th century French philosopher, Catholic, who basically said, he wasn't talking in the context of Judaism and Christianity, but he basically said, either you believe in God or you don't. If you believe in God and you're right, you have untold reward. If you believe in God and you're wrong, there is no God, nothing lost, you've lived a moral life. But if you don't believe in God and there's no God, no problem, but you haven't lived a moral life. But if you don't believe in God and there is a God, then you're in trouble. And I remember this, harkens to a bumper sticker I saw once, very subtle. It had flames on the bumper sticker, and it said, "If you don't believe in God, you better be right." Right? Very subtle. But this was really the calculus which I made in my mind, which was, you know what? As far as I know, there's no harm in this. If I believe in, the Christian Messiah, and I pledge, belief in the Christian Messiah, then you know what? I'll be saved from that. And you know what? Judaism, I will be, forsaking my ancestors. I will be going against everything which I understand to be true, read, taught to me by Jewish leaders. But you know what? They're saying something really bad is going to happen, and Judaism doesn't really say anything bad is going to happen. So that was my calculus. And I'll get into that's not correct, but that was my calculus. And I said, okay. And so laying in bed one night, I said, God, it wasn't, the most, let's say, jumping in enthusiastically, but it was, you know what? I don't want, I don't want to be punished for eternity. So this is what I'm going to do. And that's what I accepted. And it didn't give me peace. It didn't give me, closure. It left me more agitated. And I remember, it's funny, I remember exactly where I was and, doing it. And I remember that was it. But I remember thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to get up? Because remember, all this time, I'm putting on tefillin every day. All this time, I'm davening 3 times a day. I'm praying 3 times a day. All this time, people are coming up to me and saying, oh, can I introduce you to this person, this young woman? And I remember thinking, well, I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to have kids. I'm not going to have kids and raise them Jewish and have this entire, secret my whole life. And I'm certainly not going to convert to Christianity, because that's just appalling to me, this, to do that. I couldn't do that. So what could I possibly do? Maybe I could just, so really what I was going to do is basically just harbor this personal secret, but not pass it on to any future generation. And that was just going to be me. I wasn't going to go to church. There was going to be a concept that I was never going to be doing. I was just going to have this personal belief, which was really in my mind less of a belief and more of an insurance policy, which I think for most Christians who take their religion to that degree probably is the case. And that's what I did. And again, all this time I was still looking like an observant Jew because I was an observant Jew. I was an observant Jew who believed in God. I was an observant Jew who believed that you had to keep kosher and you had to pray every day and you had to keep the Sabbath and you had to, live a Jewish life. But also a Jew who was, afraid of what was going to happen if I was wrong. So that's really the life that I was living for about 2 years. But, there was really, I suppose, it wasn't a one-day kind of epiphany that changed, but this is really what happened. Nothing changed. Every day I was still obsessing, every 5 minutes going, and there was no closure in my mind. And I remember thinking, if this was true, there has to be some closure. If this was, I have gotten no peace, no closure from this whatsoever, no sense of, accomplishment or that I've gotten any closer to the emes, the truth. And so I said, I have to dig deep beyond this, because if there's a creator in the universe and there was a God, not just a God who created the world, but a God who actually cares if where my eternity is going to be, who knows and cares what I'm doing, which Jews and Christians both agree, and Muslims, we all agree that God created us and God cares about what we do. So therefore, God empowered me with a mind and with free will and an intellect, and I had to delve deeper in a way that I hadn't delved deeper before. And so again, as I said, this sort of argument, which was always presented, was, hey, there are 300, 500 proof texts in the Torah, not just in the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, but really in the entire Tanakh, the entire, Jewish Bible, pointing to the Christian Messiah, according to them, right? Various places, whether it's the prophets, whether in the 5 books, whether it's in Tehillim or Psalm, didn't matter. And so, of course, there was a Jewish response to every single one of them. But this struck me as so, it was a cat and mouse, it was a whack-a-mole. This wasn't really doing anything. But what I noticed when I started to delve deeply at these quote-unquote proof texts, I started to notice a couple defining characteristics of them, that they were frequently inconsistent, unclear, and indirect. Inconsistent, unclear, and indirect. What I mean by that is as follows. They would point to a verse, right? And they would say, this refers to the Christian Messiah who was supposed to suffer before he died. See, this is from Tehillim, this is from Psalms. And clearly this refers to the Christian Messiah, or here is from a book of Isaiah. And it says the Messiah is supposed to suffer, is supposed to die, supposed to be rejected. Well, gee, that's what happened to our Messiah. He suffered, he was rejected by the Jewish people, and he died. Boy, who does that sound like? And they present this to you without context, without any background, without reading the chapters on either side of it and say, who does it sound like? And of course, to us, they're giving us a very cherry-picked passage, and it's a very leading question. So of course, who do we think it sounds like? It doesn't sound like Christopher Columbus, right? It sounds like who they want it to sound like. But when you start to look back, and as I said, when you see that they're inconsistent, what I mean by that is that they will point to a verse which says the Messiah has to suffer. But of course, the Jewish response is, well, that's not talking about the Messiah. It's saying the Jewish people suffer on behalf of the nations. They say, no, this means the Messiah suffers on behalf of the Jewish people. Now, how do you know? How do you figure out what it means? So one is figuring out what's consistent. Are there any other places in the Torah which talk about a suffering Messiah? Not really. But there's maybe 5 or 6 other places which talk about, the role of the Jewish people as the suffering servant of God, right? So, okay, so we see that there's some consistency there. We also see that, for example, there's a lack of clarity, right? If you read this and they didn't tell you this is, referring to the Messiah, you didn't have preconceived notions of, what that character or what he was supposed to look like, you wouldn't necessarily know that's who it's referring to. So it's unclear. But when it's coming, but with the references talking about Israel, it says Israel, it says my people, it says my, Israel. So it's very clear who we're talking about. And then, of course, we're talking about indirect. So, for example, there's a quote that they pull out of nowhere, out of the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus, which says, aha, you Jews, you think, back in the day, when you had a sin, you would bring a sin offering. They say, how do you get expiation from sin? How are you redeemed from sin today? And they would say, when you used to, bring the sacrifices, it was the blood that did it. Now, of course, today we say it's the prayers and charity and good deeds. And they say, no, it's the blood. And they would point to a verse in the middle of the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, which says, talks about the blood. Now, of course, if you just read this one line on its own, it's not really clear what it's talking about. Maybe it is saying that. But when you read both surrounding text, you see, oh, it means you can't drink blood. It's talking about something very completely different. And of course, various different arguments wrong with, even if we sacrificed a bull, that was a sin offering, doesn't talk about believing in a person. So again, it didn't make sense. And again, it wasn't just that they gave arguments and they were refuted, but one bad argument times 5,000 is still one bad argument, right? If you have 10 trillion to the power of 0, it's still 1, right? It's not quite 0. It's a good argument. But the idea is that you can throw 100 bad arguments at me, but if they're just bad arguments, it doesn't matter how many of them are. But there was even a more fundamental point which was made, which I think probably was the defining door which shut this on it forever for me, which was, we can talk all day about proof text. Proof text A, no, it doesn't. Yes, it means that. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. But ultimately, this was really... It was a rabbi in a place called Lakewood, New Jersey, named Rabbi Yisrael Chaim Blumenthal, who I think articulated this most powerfully. And he said this as follows. He basically said, let's take a step back. We're not talking about Jews and Christians debating over the fundamentals. We don't believe in the Bible. They believe in the Bible. And there's a bumper sticker more in the States than here. It says, the Bible says it. I believe it. That settles it, right? There are millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who believe this intensely. And so, but the question is, how do you know the Bible is true? Jews, we have a tradition, we have a Masorah that goes back to Har Sinai, to Mount Sinai with Moses, that our parents told our parents, and our parents told our parents, and so on and so forth. Now, they also have a tradition. Christians also have a tradition. They don't necessarily define it that way, but they also believe that the rabbis were chosen by God. How do you know that? Because how else do we know that the Bible is inerrant? How do you know that an aleph is pronounced ah? How do you know a base or a bent is pronounced ba? It's only because of our tradition. It's only because the rabbis told us that it's pronounced ba and that's not pronounced ka, right? How do we know that Isaiah was a prophet? Who determined Isaiah was a prophet? Was there a vote? There was no vote. It was because of the Jewish, essentially the Masorah, which had basically, call it Yavneh. There was a council after the destruction of the temple, but however we call it, This became part of the Jewish canon, the Jewish Bible, because the Jewish leadership had decreed it to be so. That's how there are plenty of other books which didn't make it into the Bible. The book of Tobit, the book of Maccabees, the book of Judith, right? These books did not make it into the Jewish Bible. And Protestants, for example, the ones we're talking about here, they don't believe that's in the Bible. How do we know that, Martin Luther, for example, the founder really of Protestantism, called the book of Esther, right? Megillus Esther, which we read on Purim, he called it a Jewish invention. He said, no, I don't believe that the book of Esther is part of the Bible. Meanwhile, 99% of Christians today believe, of course, the book of Esther is in the Bible, just like Genesis and Exodus and Isaiah. How do they know that? It's because we told them that. How do we know that the rabbis didn't corrupt it from the get-go? How do we know that, that Hillel and, all of these, characters in our tradition have articulated and, Yehuda Hanasi and these people who were integral in keeping our tradition alive, how do they trust them? Because simultaneously, the argument goes that God blinded you, that, you do not know who your own Messiah is. You do not know who your own God is, right? You thought God was this, God is not that. You thought your Messiah was just supposed to be a holy person bringing you back, but you never take your image off God. No, Messiah is also God, right? All these arguments, but that we somehow are completely supernaturally blind to this, but that they trust that we, completely transcribe the entire Bible perfectly without a single error, that we know who God was, that we, up until the point, that the Messiah showed up, we forgot everything supernaturally, but that they trust us. This struck me as the first thing which doesn't pass the smell test, so to speak. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. There was another component, which was really this, which was, what is the Torah but a letter from Hashem, God, the creator of the universe, to the Jewish people? Now, if you read the entire Chumash, the entire Torah, as we do in the Parshas, and the not just the Parshas, but really the Haftarahs, the entire Bible, it is abundantly clear that this is a transmission from God to his people, God to God's people, right? This is not a message to the Norwegians or the Chinese or the Athenians. This is a message to the Jewish people as God's Kadosh, as his holy nation. It's a message from them. It's no different than if you got a letter, a wedding invitation, or a love letter in your mailbox, but your number 123, and then the guy was addressed to number 125, and you open it up and you read it as if it's talking to you, and you say, "Wow, what a wonderful love letter I got, to me." Even though it's addressed to your neighbor, it's his name on it, it's his address on it. You pick it up, you read it, and you say, "This is incredible," and you believe, and you act, and you treat it as if this letter is referring to you. Well, it's not. And this is the other issue here. So like I said, if we take a much bigger macro step back, we can bicker all day long about this proof text. And yes, those proof texts, they're built on just a mound of sand, right? But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because you throw 500 darts, one or two of them will bother you. And even though it doesn't make sense that 1 or 2 out of 500 will maybe sort of bother, the bigger question is, that's not even the way to begin. The way to begin is, how do we even know this is true? It's because the Jewish people said so, because the Jewish people were trustworthy. You cannot on one hand say the Jewish people were simultaneously blinded by God, and we have no idea what we're talking about, but also that you believe everything we're talking about in the Bible is true, and we describe God exactly without a single scintilla of error, infallibly, 100% to the nth degree. Impossible. If that's the case, then God is the biggest trickster, right? God forbid, that can't be the case. But they also believe, as we do, that God is love, that God loves us, that God wants the best for us, that God doesn't trick us, that God gave us minds and faculties and the intelligence to discern MS, truth, from sheker, falsehood. So if all this is true, the only scenario in which we could actively embrace what I had embraced was that if God was this trickster, to say nothing of, a lifetime of genuine searching and genuine openness. If you're wrong and you believe you believe the Masorah which God has given you with the best of your faculty, but you got your numbers off a little bit, you're in the you go the wrong way. Inconceivable. It's impossible for a loving God to do that. That God, any God that did that would not be loving, and any God which would demand that perfection on an imperfect mind would not be perfect. It would not be any God, certainly, that Judaism nor Christianity officially purports to believe in. So I think all of this really came together, and I said, listen, this is just it can't be done, right? Because the only real way to get out of this is to use the faculties God gave me and use the best that I possibly could. And that's, of course, what I did. The house of cards really started to fall after that. They were already starting to fall, and it just was so poor. And the more you read about it, the more you see that to be the case, and of everybody else who who experienced the same thing. And that was really the story, when I came back. And really, when I came back, there's no grand story, there's no grand fireworks display. And I think that's perhaps the most telling, is that when I realized this was just completely wrong, I just sort of put it away and never looked at it since. And that was a level of closure, right? And of course, I've continued to be involved with Jews for Judaism and the cause long since then, but it has created and provided a level of closure that is infinitely better than was before, right? Before was guilt, it was fear, it was threats, it was basically a proverbial, omnipotent gun to my head. And this was what the creator of the universe purportedly was doing, throwing all the evidence my way and saying, 99.9% of the evidence says this, but this little thing, maybe if you interpret it a certain way with certain rose-colored glasses, you might look at it a different way. It didn't make any sense. And I think perhaps the biggest part was I started to do a lot of reading and research, and I had an entire textbook full of contemporary Christian scholars who definitely took the religion seriously, who 99% of the time were taking the Jewish interpretation of these views. And that was really, for me, most shocking, which was not even the Christian scholars teaching at these Christian seminaries even believed that these proof texts referred to what they claimed. So I think that was, for me, really just, it was completely, it was open and shut at that point, and I walked away forever. But I think what for me was the biggest, and I'll end with this in a moment, the biggest chiddush, the biggest novelty, the biggest insight for me, which was, if I hadn't come across that video, if I hadn't come across by chance that YouTube video, I essentially went into battle. I went into life completely unprepared. I essentially, because of that video, forced me into a dark and scary place, which I would not want anybody else to do. But ultimately what it did was it gave me muscles, right? The idea is, if you go to the gym, I've been to the gym once in my life. I'm not making that mistake again. But my understanding is, if you go to the gym, you lift muscles, it gives you muscle mass. And the more you do, you go 1 pound, 5 pound, 20 pound, and you build muscle, and you build, and you pick up heavier and heavier weights. But if you never develop those weights, then you are ripe for the picking. Right? We are completely vulnerable. And unfortunately, in Israel, this messianic movement. So messianic movement is the Christian movement, which isn't, hey, convert to Christianity. It's, we're Jewish. There's a church 10 minutes away from me. It has it has a Jewish name. It has Hebrew writing. It has you've seen these. It has a Magen David. I haven't been inside, but it has a Torah scroll, the Israeli flag. It looks like many shuls, but it is 100% a church. That's Messianic Judaism. It dresses up in Jewish clothing, but it is 100% Christian. And unfortunately, it has developed probably 200,000 adherents in recent years. And in Israel, recent Russian immigrants are extremely vulnerable, because these are people who came out of decades and decades of Soviet oppression. Even the ones who grew up 10, 20 years ago, Soviet Union's long gone, they grew up in an ignorant environment where they didn't know anything, and they've been, unfortunately, not unsuccessful at poaching and stealing these people. And so I think, for me, one of the most powerful lessons was, if I hadn't by chance come across this video, I would have been ripe for the picking. It is a different scenario, and it would have just been that easy. And if it was that easy for me, it would be easy for others. And unfortunately, it has been that easy for others. And so I think, particularly, as the Rabbi mentioned, now that we're in the month of Av, we talk about this time when we're supposed to cry, or we're supposed to be upset for the destruction of the temple. And for me, for many of us, it's hard. Why do we cry over something we can't even understand? But I think the more that we understand, for me, one of the saddest things I always think of is that there are these Christian missionaries who know the Bible inside and out. And they know it better than most Jews, most secular Jews, many of us, because they spent a life devoted to warping it and understanding it with a particular lens. They're coming in first with that. But nonetheless, this is our inheritance. There's others who are taking our love letter from God to us, the letter from the God to the Jewish people. Here's the inheritance. Here's the, the inheritance of the sons of Jacob to the Jewish people, Klal Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael. This is to us. And our neighbor took it from us and is reading it and is now saying, this isn't your inheritance. This is ours. The church, in the Middle Ages, the church said, the Catholic Church, that the church is the new Israel, that the Catholic Church has replaced Israel. Now they've stepped back from that, but nonetheless, that's what theology has been for 2,000 years. And I think that if we reclaim our inheritance, the rabbi said, it's not what's missing, it's what we want back, right? We want back where we can see God, where we can feel God at the tip of our nose. That's how close God is to us. He's not some estranged foreign feeling. And I think that's one of the ideas that many Jews, we can grasp again, that all the laws, all the halakhas, it's really all about that relationship, because ultimately God loves us and God wants a relationship with us. And unfortunately, my story, unfortunately, I had to go through it, but fortunately, my story was one where I was able to develop those muscles and get involved. And as a result, I now have 3 kids in Beis Yaakov, and third soon to be there in September if schools begin, and religious home and actively involved. And listen, if it hadn't been for that Christian missionary, I probably just would have been a very and a semi-observant Jew, learning and growing and doing these wonderful things. But it was because of that I was able to go from those 5-pound muscles to those 50-pound muscles. And so my hope and bracha and blessing for all of us is that we can develop those muscles and develop those same skills without having to go through that trial by fire as well. So thank you very much for your time. Happy to take some questions if you'd like.
Okay, Robert, what's your Jewish name that you call yourself now?
Reuven.
Reuven. That was very, very fascinating. To hear your journey, how, as you say, that most probably you could have lived Judaism at a very surface level, and somehow through your experience, you've dived deep into Judaism and have found something much more richer that leads your life and your children, your wife and your children, and everything you do. As a yeshiva bacher who was involved in some anti-missionary work, your story is quite unique. I just want to make a few comments and I hope if you have questions, you can put in the chat, or in a moment we'll let you ask it directly. But your situation is unique because most people who get involved in Christian sort of in the grasp or of the Christian missionizing, it doesn't happen through a video, but they're accosted by people and they're reined in, and usually with a lot of love and a lot of care and a lot of interest, even before theology. Where your battle was more on a theological level, as opposed to seemingly like you didn't really have much interaction on the ground with actual missionaries or groups. So is that correct? Or it was totally?
No, you're 100% correct. I think that most people have an impression of missionaries coming to your door and giving you some leaflets. But when was the last time you ever bought anything from the door from somebody you never heard of with leaflets? That's not how it happens typically. Typically it happens through one-on-one engagement, right? At the water cooler, or at the kids' soccer practice, your neighbor, your friend. And again, I want to, just iterate, these are, for the most part, people who genuinely care. They love you. They care about you. They don't want you to suffer. They believe that they're doing you a genuine service. I'm talking about the majority of people here, right? Who are not like sort of anti-Judaism per se. They genuinely believe they have the truth and you don't, and they want to help and save you. And so that's why they will find, and they're exhorted to do so, by their faith, right? Islam is much the same way, of course. As is Mormonism, right? There's sort of a joke that Mormonism, of course, which began about 100 in the 1840s, I think, in Utah, in the States, or Illinois, and then moved to Utah, it calls itself Christian. Most Christians don't call themselves Mormons. There's about 15 million Mormons in the world, and they believe that there was a prophet named Joseph Smith from the 1800s. And to most Christians, that sounds absolutely ludicrous. Right? What are you talking about? Silly, ridiculous. But the funny thing is, they are rapidly growing. And, there's a sort of a joke that, God created Mormons so Christians know how Jews feel, right? We have this breakaway religion that takes our holy text and then says that, that we're missing the boat here. Well, the Mormons, that's literally what they did to the Christians. And so, and again, so it's sort of, it's God 2.0 and God 3.0, and you need to get your latest upgrade. But the reality is that, yes, you're correct. Most of it is through personal engagement. Most of it is, and you make a very important point, it's not primarily a theological argument. For most Jews, what they seek, the people who are seeking, and I know many people who came back here, we're talking about the people who came back, is that what they were seeking was a relationship with God, right? The people who were seeking this out, right? If you completely don't care about this at all, and you're just not attuned to reality with a capital R or truth with a capital T, you're not really so concerned. Someone says, yeah, I don't believe it, it's all nonsense. We're not talking about those people. We're talking about the people who are genuinely attuned that there's something bigger in the world, that there is a God in the world who loves us, who creates us. They seek to connect to that. And so I think what the lacking is sometimes, not in Judaism, not in actual Yiddishkeit, but unfortunately in sometimes the way that many of us practice it, it becomes rote. I'm sure you've spoken about this many times, and I'm sure we all know it is very easy for Judaism to become, Jewish practice to become rote, not because it should be, but simply because that's human nature. And so I think this is the challenge. Right? I'm sorry?
You mean robotic? It becomes like robotic.
Yeah, exactly. You sort of just do it and do it. And again, not because it should be done that way, of course, but because I believe that is part of the challenge, in which that's why we are given these, one of the reasons we are given, halachas and laws and actions to do, is because we have to find God in every little thing we do, right? If there was no halachas, no Shabbos didn't exist, and kosher didn't exist, but now we have the opportunity. We get up in the morning, we say Moda Ani. We can have an opportunity to think about God. We come out of the washroom, we say Ashi Yatzer, thank you, God, right? We eat a food, before we eat the food, we say thank you, God. After we eat the food, we say thank you, God. God has laid out a framework, this, Torah's Chaim, the Torah for life, where God is in every single moment. Now, of course, we can blind ourselves to that. Of course, we can tune that out and put it on mute if we so desire. But that's my understanding, is, of course, the entire model behind it is that is supposed to be where God is in every single moment of our day, in a comforting, loving, warm embrace. And so for the Jews who are often involved in the Messianic movement, this is what they don't feel, because many of them, I should say that the 99.99% of them do not come from religious or Jewish home, Orthodox homes. They come from homes where, I'll tell you, there's a, Rabbi Skobach, who's with Jews for Judaism, you tell me stories, that he would, he's the one who counsels many of these Jews and who was instrumental as well in bringing me back. And he would speak to many of these people, and it was clear that many of them did not come from homes where there was much Jewish knowledge really at all. Or if there was, we lit Shabbos candles, or we had challah, but there was nothing more than that. There was no relationship with God. There was no joyful prayer. There was no joyful connection to the Almighty. And so that's what they were missing. And that's what I think is clear, that the people who have been engaged with it, that's really, they might be smart people and they might be able to, but they're missing something emotionally. And so as Jews, we're a very cerebral people. Right, we're very intelligent people, and yet we're people of the book, as Muslims call us, people of the book. And yet sometimes we tend to, I think, as individuals, discount the emotion, the emotive element to a human being, which is no less important, I believe, than the intellect. God didn't just give us a brain; He gave us a heart, and that, of course, is one of the reasons the Hasidic movement, as I'm sure I don't need to say, started, is because Judaism can become very robotic, very mind-driven, and of course it should be, but in conjunction with the heart. And as soon as we make that divorce, we're missing out on the biggest joy, the biggest pleasure that a human being can possibly know, right? And the way I was always taught is that we want to be connoisseurs of pleasure. Jews want to be connoisseurs of pleasure. We want to get the best pleasure in the world. But how do you get the best pleasure? Do you get it by having, the best ice cream? Those are all transitory pleasures, right? We want the best pleasure in the world, which is connecting to the creator of the universe, which sounds sort of hokey. What does that mean? But when it happens and you feel it, it's an incredible thing. And that's what God wants us. He doesn't want us to have this level of pleasure, right? Why drive a 30-year-old Hyundai? No apologies to anyone driving a 30-year-old Honda. But why drive that when you can drive, a Bugatti or a Rolls Royce, right? That's what God wants to give us. There are many pleasures that God gives us in life, but the greatest pleasure is connecting to the ultimate reality, ultimate truth, and then, our Father in heaven. And so that's really, I think, what people who have embraced the movement have felt lacking in Judaism. And that's the biggest tragedy, because we have it in front of us. They just don't know it.
So I just want to, if anyone wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. I just want to ask you a question because this is something very interesting. You're talking about how the reason people are vulnerable to be caught into the web of the Christianity in some form of missionizing, and obviously we're talking about people who are not telling you just become a Christian, but you can be a Jew and Jews for Jesus and Messianic Judaism. But you're saying what's missing is really the emotional connection. And the question is, do you feel that it's really mostly just about the emotional connection, where many people feel Judaism doesn't really, never gets you connected in a relationship with God? Even people go to synagogue a few times a year and they may show up, but they might come to the Seder, but there's no emotional connection there. And obviously no emotional connection to the bigger picture. But what about the idea of knowledge? Let's take a scenario where someone who has a great knowledge of Judaism and learns Judaism, has learned, has studied, knows the books, do you feel that they are vulnerable as well if they're not really so emotionally involved? Do you feel knowledge is also very strong? It's important for people to give their children to make sure they have the knowledge, because when you have the knowledge, you can't be swayed. Like you said, at the end of the day, what woke you up was that the arguments are very superficial. And if you had a strong knowledge in Judaism, like many Orthodox Jews would never buy into these Christian things because they know it's not true. It doesn't fit into the Bible that they know. Or you feel that even someone has knowledge, you don't really connect to Judaism on an emotional level, on a deeper level, you feel that a person could still be vulnerable. I'm not sure if you understand what I'm asking.
I do. I mean, I think that, so first of all, just to your first point here, you asked about those people go to shul and they're connected and they feel emotional. It's not that there's not an emotional connection to Judaism, to Jewish life. Of course there is. I mean, Judaism, I think for many, that's why I said in the beginning, I grew up as a coronary, I'm a Jew in my heart, a coronary Jew. I was a Jew, but what that meant was it was a lack of, emotional connection to God specifically. I think for many of us, it's a Jewish cultural thing, which is not a bad thing in itself, right? This is one of the elements which God gives us. We're connected to our people, right? This is the critical element. So that's just a small clarification. But I think the people who are, all of us, right? We all have the faculties to read, to learn, to grow until really the last moment that we draw breath on this planet. That absolutely, knowledge is the single biggest, inoculation against this, and that's why I hasten to add that there are all of these people, whenever they describe, their upbringing, many of them would describe, well, I grew up in an Orthodox home. But then when they describe the Orthodox home, yes, I grew up in a very religious Orthodox home. We lit candles, we had challah. On Saturdays, we went to the baseball game. Okay, fine. It clearly wasn't an Orthodox home. They were clearly describing it as traditional home. Wonderful, to have tradition for sure. But it's very clear that, when we see this, when I met and spoke to many of these people, all of them, there were two critical components. They were all lacking this emotive connection to the Creator, to the Almighty. But it's a given that they were all, I don't want to use the term ignorant because that has sort of almost sounds like it has a connotation, but they were not knowledgeable in Judaism the way that, one might describe a knowledgeable Jew, right? These are people who, just simply weren't, right? They just simply weren't. Maybe they went to no Jewish school. Maybe they went to Jewish school till they were 10 or 12 for their bar mitzvah, right, on weekends, Sunday school, something like that. We're talking about the people who truly understand, not just, they read the parsha, but really they understand the nature of, of the Jewish people, the role of the Jewish people. They read how many of us have read the entire Tanakh, the entire Bible, right, cover to cover, the Jewish Bible, right? I think so. And again, Talmud study is probably, in my experience, the most challenging intellectual workout ever. But I think what I meant to say was that there's this tremendous intellectual workout that we get when we're studying Torah and learning Judaism, whether it's Gemara, Hasidus, or Mishnah, or Parsha, or Haftarah, whatever it is, right? Or Navi, it doesn't matter what it is. But the idea is that I think at the back of our mind, or more in the back of our mind, it should always be, this is more than just an intellectual exercise. This isn't, on Mondays I study calculus, on Tuesday I study Gemara, on Wednesday I study algebra. It's not that, right? It has to be more than that. Of course, even if we look at it, right, bidi ebed, so to speak, just as even if as little as it's purely intellectual exercise, study Torah, we will be better off, right? Because it's like, even if you eat the healthiest food in the world, but you're not consciously eating the healthiest food in the world, it doesn't matter. It's still good for you, right? It's funny, my kids sometimes, they'll pick up, like today we got some sugar-free gum. They said, Daddy, is this healthy for you? I said, it's not healthy for you. It's just not as unhealthy as, say, a chocolate bar, right? But when it comes to Torah, it is healthy for you. It is good for you, even if you don't know what you're doing, even if doing a mitzvah, even if you don't know what it's about, of course it's good for you. But kol v'chomer, all the more so if you do know what it is, and we can fully embrace that, right? There's nothing wrong, right, with studying Torah and just leaving it as is. But boy, we're missing on 90% of the sweetness here, right? Imagine sort of, eating an apple, but only eating the skin. Okay, a little bit, it's good, but imagine just getting to the sweetness, imagine, eating an orange and only eating the outside, but not to the pockets of sweetness and juice. Clearly I want some fruit, right? The idea here is that, like, we can learn Torah as an intellectual exercise, and there's tremendous merit and benefit for us intellectually, spiritually, so on. But again, there is a whole different madrega level, and that's, I think, what we should all be striving for, is looking at everything in life as an intellectual and emotional. So for sure, the vast majority of people who are involved in this movement, who came from a Jewish background, the 99.99% absolutely fall into a position where they were not Jewishly knowledgeable. That's a given. But I think but they could have lived their entire lives like that. Tragically, they could have lived their whole lives. What the straw that broke the camel's back, which made them vulnerable to this and being ensnared in this, is that they were looking for a particular emotive connection to God as an emotive thing. And again, we all do, but those are people who had that very toxic combination of being intellectually, or not intellectually, but sort of not being Jewishly familiar or knowledgeable, for no fault of their own, right? The Rambam would call them Tinok Shenishba, a child stolen, right? These are people, no fault of their own. They grew up not knowledgeable, but who also looked and said, I want, connection. I want to feel God there. And they were presented with that opportunity by someone else, not knowing that either in the texts or in real life, that's what Judaism is literally every single minute of the day. So I think we're all vulnerable to certain degrees. And the biggest inoculation against that, of course, is learning more, studying more, is praying, is living a full Jewish life and living it, faithfully and embracing it, right? Every little component is good, right? Every little thing is good, but the more, the better, right? If one is good, two is better.
Great. Is there anyone has a question they'd like? I mean, Robert's been very...
I think it said Amy's iPad wants to... You don't look like an Amy, sir, but I think he wants to speak.
Yeah, 1 second. Let me unmute. Ellie, unmute.
Unmute. Okay.
Yeah.
No, Amy is next to me, is my wife. First of all, I want to congratulate you on your beautiful lecture that you went into in depth with everything. And when you were saying your speech, especially about those 300 or so organizations pounding into or scratching into our Torah or something, and getting more than knowledge than some or most Jews. To me, it sounded like the Romans back 1,000 years ago, pounding on the doors of Beit HaMikdash. And so in your speech, it so happened that it's the time to remember these things now. This is our time for Chorban Beit HaMikdash. So what is, what are things that we can do to remediate to this? I mean, of course, we can talk till eternity about this, but is this the picture that I got, what you were saying?
That this is sort of a problem,
like a destruction, instead of 1,000 years ago, it was the destruction of Beit HaMikdash. Today is the destruction of the inner of the Jews themselves,
course. I mean, I certainly would say that's what I mentioned. I mean, absolutely. I believe that this is the Korban, all the same. I mean, just as there was a little, it can be hard to hear, but there was a physical Holocaust 80 years ago or 75 years ago. And the loss of Jews today is although without physical pain, but this is a Holocaust of souls to some degree. Quiet. We don't see it. We don't know it. And it's not just that. It's that, unfortunately, so many Jews have, we don't know what's in front of us. And I think this is one of the perils of living in such a tremendously wealthy society, where it's very easy to ignore it. It's very easy to ignore it, to not know about it at all. And so I think this is the opportunity on us. So what is the opportunity on us? Is to become more knowledgeable ourselves, to share that one knowledge with others, right? As there was if we know Aleph, teach Aleph, to invite, not right now, when it permits, invite, people who are less Jewishly connected to a Shabbat dinner, to a class, go with them, bring them, right? Support your local Chabad, right? So support, Jewish organizations that are doing education and outreach. Like I said, I think we can do so much, as ourselves, and everybody can do to what our degree is, in every, like I said, whether it's hosting, whether it's teaching, whether it's inviting. Zoom classes, you're going to a Zoom class, send it to a few friends, send it to your kids, send it to your neighbors, send it to your cousins, hey, I'm going to this very, wonderful young man, Robert Walker, right? He's going to be speaking at this thing, right? A little self-serving. I know I've already spoken, but you know what I mean? There's so many opportunities to, I think, share this inheritance that we have, right? It's that we've been given this, $25 billion, right, inheritance from our Father in heaven, right? But infinitely bigger than $25 billion. And it's sitting in front of us. And it's like, here's this instruction manual, how to go to the bank, and, what our deposit instructions are, and how do we get the money out of the bank? And, and then we can tap into that, right? And it doesn't matter, we'll be perfect. Perfection is impossible. Right. But you know what? Every day, maybe we can take out $10 million. Every day we'll get more and get stronger and get better and why wouldn't we do that? Right. This basically
sky is the limit.
Absolutely. Right. And listen, Rabbi Akiva didn't start learning until he was 40. And he became one of the greatest sages of the Jewish world has ever known. So I think that we need to be demanding more of ourselves, but growing more. We're growing more emotively, speaking to God. Right, learning more of the Torah, right, going more to the virtual classes. Never been easier with a click of the button than it is now, right? Supporting the organizations that are doing good work in our community, inviting people to to this, and so on and so forth. But absolutely, I would agree with you that this is a crisis like it was then, and not just the Messianic movement. The Messianic movement is a symptom of a much larger malaise, which is that the Jewish people, if every single, what Rabbi Krasnansky was saying earlier, if all the Jewish people knew what our, knew what our role was, and we're at 100%, no, there's never 100%, but that's our best inoculation. They are operating, the success that we're seeing now is happening because of the failure, unfortunately, on our part. That to the degree that there are Jews who are unknowledgeable, that's fertile feeding. And the one point you raised was, why are there 300 different organizations?
Yeah, why are they so successful into?
Well, so I think if you can look at it two ways. You can look at it and say, Nebuch, that there have been a couple 100,000 Jews over the last, generation which have converted to Christianity. You can also look at it and say there are $300 million every single year. That's $1 million every single day that is being devoted, to converting Jews in this world. And yet still, that's all they've accomplished. They have tried to move heaven and earth to convert us, and they haven't. 2,000 years, the Jewish people have remained, true and loyal to our Torah. Why? Right? That's the tremendous thing. For sure, unfortunately, Nebuch, we need to fight against that, is that there's going to be Jews who get ensnared in this. We need to do everything we can. But I think that we shouldn't let that, forget that this is an unprecedented renaissance of the Jewish people we're seeing right now over the last 20 years, right? Jews coming back to Judaism, Jews embracing it, non-Jews embracing it. I can tell you story after story after story of incredible non-Jews I know who have converted to Judaism, non-Jews who live Noahide lifestyles, right? Who are just these incredible people, Christian pastors and priests and deacons, right? I can go on and on and on. But I think that, we don't, not only Judaism doesn't proselytize, we actively discourage, we turn people away 3 times, right? And we still see this incredible thirst, right? This incredible movement, of people seeking truth and of Jews seeking this. And so I don't want to give the impression that the Jewish people are somehow engulfed with this. That's not the case. 99% of Jews have not embraced this, right? The 1% that are we need to fight against that. But again, we need to still keep in mind the tremendous impact that we're having in the world and what the world would look like without us. And despite the fact that they are spending $300 million a year to convert us, they haven't succeeded yet. And the reason they're spending $300 million a year to convert us and not to convert people in China or India, I mean, of course they are, but why there's a disproportionate focus on us is that we were supposed to be the first ones to accept it 2,000 years ago. He's supposed to be our Messiah. We were supposed to be the first ones to get on this boat. And the fact that we haven't presents a not insignificant theological challenge, because it suggests that, like, hey, you were supposed to be the first buyer here and you didn't. So there's something not adding up. And I think, if I may posit, a lot of scholars of anti-Semitism have said that a lot of the reason for medieval Christian anti-Semitism in Europe was the simple existence of the Jew. The existence of the Jew was a thorn in the side. It was a spanner, a spoke in the wheel of the traditional theology, which said the church replaced you. If the church replaced you, why are you still here? So I think that helps to explain why this focus on the Jewish people and converting us has been so incessant and so, one might say, obsessive. It's because if they could convert every single person in the world. If they haven't converted us, it's like walking around with a shoe with a giant stone. That's the first thing that's just not sitting right.
Very, 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 very well said. And all points of the fact that they're trying so hard and yet they're not being successful. I want to tell you a story. Reminded me when I was a yeshiva bacher. I went, one of my missions, I went Chabad always to trying to bring Judaism to all corners or all little places, is we spent some time in Salt Lake City, Utah. Today there's a shliach there. But when we went, there was no Chabad presence. And I went with my friend and we met a lot of people then. And we went to see sort of the Mormon center and the buildings and the few buildings that a Jew is allowed to walk into. It's not part of their church. And I remember they gave us a tour. They had their missionaries giving us a tour. Sometimes they thought that we may be open to their missionizing as well. Getting a chance to see what's going on. And I remember when we finished the tour, I hear Hebrew. And I hear Hebrew in Salt Lake City, Utah. Then I go into a room. There's a big room where all the tours finish. And there's a group of people speaking Hebrew. So I go over to them, what's going on? It's a group from Israel who's doing a tour through the States, and they stopped in Utah, and they did a whole tour of the... And while I'm talking to some of them, I see that the missionaries are giving every one of them a Mormon Bible. And they're all taking the Bible. And I was telling them, what are you doing? This is Christianity. You're a Jew. But they were saying, yeah, they're giving it to us for free. Big deal. They're so nice. We'll take it. We'll look at it. It's all right. I asked some of them, do you have a Chumash at home? Do you have a Jewish Bible at home? I don't know. When I was a kid, I had one when I went to school, but I don't think I have one. They said, you ready to take a Bible, a Mormon Bible home? You never know. A lot of places, they look for little openings where small little things they put in their hand. And sometimes one of these people in the vulnerable moment, they open up and they start looking and they remember it was a nice person, who was friendly, and you never know where that can happen. So it's like you say, we have to be very careful, even though it doesn't touch a large percentage. I think only a tiny percentage, but we never know who that percentage is coming from. We have to be very careful to hold on to what's ours. That's why the Rabbi had a campaign. We should fill our homes with Jewish books. Every child should grow up knowing that they have a book in their house, a Chumash, a Siddur, a prayer book, and the Torah and other Jewish books, and obviously for the Passover books, etc. But so important to surround ourselves with these things because you never know. We're all inside searching, and you never know when someone can tap into us and maybe take us down the wrong path. Any other questions before we close up? Anyone else? I think you've made everyone very happy and satisfied. And Robert, we really want to thank you very much. Just want to finish up with a cute little joke. And one of the points that you said in your story, there's a story that goes that Rabbi was once giving a concert. And in the last piece of his concert was singing Psalm 23, the Lord is our shepherd. And he gives an unbelievable rendition. And when he finishes, everyone is clapping. And one guy gets up in the bleachers. A guy gets up, short little guy gets up and is shouting at the top of his lungs. He says, you didn't do it that good. You got to do it again. So Pavarotti wants to make sure that he leaves a good impression. So he said, okay, I'll do it again. Anyways, he sings it again. Everyone gives him a round of applause. This guy gets up and says, still not. You still didn't do it well. He sings it a third time, and the Jew and this fellow's not happy. So he tells the guy, listen, if you're not happy the way I sing it, why don't you come down? Pavarotti says, and you sing it. So he comes down. This old little hunchback Jew comes down to the stage, and he doesn't have a voice like Pavarotti at all, and he starts singing. And before he finishes the psalm, the whole crowd is crying. Everyone's in tears and they're crying. So Pavarotti looks at him and says, I have the most gifted voice. And I got a round of applause. You sing and your voice is not so great at all. And everyone's crying. What's going on? So he says, the Jew says, I'll tell you the difference between you and I. He says, you know the psalm, but I know the shepherd. I know the Lord. We're his people. And that's what as Jews, we have to remember that, when anyone quotes the Bible, you have to remember first, it's our Bible. It's God's, like Robert said, Reuben said, it's God's communication to us, through us to the rest of the world. But no one owns the Bible. It's God's, it's ours. It's our direct communication and relationship with Hashem. That's what at this time of the year we have to strengthen is our relationship with God. God loves us, cares for us. He destroyed the temple, but didn't destroy the Jewish people. He's kept us going and strong, and we're as strong as ever, and God willing, we'll get even stronger. Very soon we'll merit with the coming of Mashiach. We'll have our third temple, and we'll be in a way that the whole world will recognize the truth of God and Torah and the Jewish people.
Amen.
So I don't know if Robert want to say a last word before we close off.
Well, really, it's just to reiterate, obviously, to thank you and to reiterate, I think that this time, I've always struggled, and I think all of us probably to some degree, living in a society today where we don't really feel we're lacking much, we cry for something that's lacking, but we're not suffering. I mean, there's plenty of problems facing Jews around the world, both as individual Jews and as, there are still plenty of anti-Semitism, facing the Jewish people in the Middle East and here in North America, certainly in Europe and elsewhere. But nonetheless, it's very hard to feel that there's a churban, that there's a crisis, that there's a challenge. And I think that, for us, this is an opportunity to think not just of, what we're missing, but what would a perfect world look like? What would a world look like where God's presence is everywhere, right? Where we knew right from wrong, if we knew truth from falsehood, like the back of your hand, you could see it. Like that's what the world looks like in a messianic age. And I think that for me, particularly in this, in the 9 days in the month of Av, the more I dwell on that, what the world looks like, then I can see this huge chasm between what the world looks like now and what it should look like. When I look in, I say, listen, I have a roof over my head and food in my stomach. What's wrong with the world? Of course, at an intellectual level, there's supposed to be. But when I think about what the world could be in a perfect world, then all of a sudden you realize how truly imperfect it is, right? And how truly sad and how ultimately the Jewish people, I think that the prophet Isaiah Yeshayahu called us the Or L'Goyim, the light unto nations. I think this is an opportunity for us to reflect on how we as a collective, starting with individuals, can up our game, and that starts at home.
So thank you so much, and thank you all for joining tonight, participating, and we shall only have blessings and good things. And thanks again for being together.
Thank you. Have a good
All
night.
the best. Yes, great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Night.
Night. Thank you all.
Ça nous a vu, Tina. That's it.
It was so nice seeing you, Lisette.
Thank you. Nice to see you too.
Helen,
Sorry, I missed the challah today.
don't worry, it's fine. Next
I
time.
had to make Albert's fish, otherwise it would have been too old by tomorrow.
No problem. Don't worry. Next time you'll
Okay.
come.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Be well. Good night.
Thank you.
The challah was
Question, Rabbi,
beautiful,
question.
Tina.
Yeah.
Question, please. When did Tisha B'Av start? It started 2 days ago?
No, Tisha B'Av is next Thursday. Rosh Chodesh Av, the first day of Av was today. Tisha B'Av is next Thursday. Wednesday night, Thursday is the fast. But the 9 days where we try to stay away from meat and wine, except on Shabbat and other pleasures, we start today.
Today.
Yeah.
So we stay away from
Keep on
meat?
serving fish to Albert.
Yeah, I did fish for Albert. Say hi.
Hello, Rabbi.
Thank you. Well, thanks.
Okay. Thanks.
Dina, thank you
Great
very
question,
much for the
Ellie.
challah. Amy brought a piece of challah. It's delicious.
Ah, you got an early
Ellie,
taste.
when are you going to come join my husband's minyan?
Amy keeps on going to the Chabad more than me.
Yeah, Zalmi said that today. Zalmi came in and he said that. He said, your wife is always there.
Ellie, we keep doors open. You don't have to worry about COVID at Chabad.
I don't know. Yeah.
You could
I wanna
stand
take
by
it-
the door. You could
I wanna
stand as
take it
close to
easy.
the door as possible.
Yeah.
Great.
Anyway, see you all.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you.